My name is Arthur Wells. I am 68 years old, and for every one of those years, I've lived on this same plot of land in rural Ohio. This farm isn't just property to me, it's a living history. My grandfather carved it out of the wilderness with his own two hands, and my father expanded it, taming the soil until it gave us everything we needed. I inherited it, and with it, a deep, bone-bred understanding of its rhythms, its moods, and its secrets. Or at least, I thought I did. I've seen 100-year floods turn my lower pastures into a lake, and I've seen droughts crack the earth open like a dry piece of leather. I've watched tornadoes spin across the horizon, and I've hunkered down through blizzards that buried us in silence for a week. I am not a man given to wild imagination or superstition. The land teaches you practicality. You deal with what's real, what's in front of you, because anything else is a waste of time and energy you simply don't have. The farm sits at the end of a long gravel road, flanked on three sides by endless fields of corn and soy. But to the west, it backs right up against the edge of the Shawnee State Forest. That forest is a different world. It's old, dark, and dense. The trees stand so close together that even on the brightest day, the forest floor is a place of perpetual twilight. People call it the Little Smokies of Ohio, and for good reason. It's a rugged, sprawling wilderness, full of deep ravines and rocky outcrops. It's a place where you can get turned around and lost in a matter of minutes, if you don't know what you're doing. I've hunted in those woods my whole life. I know the game trails, the streams, the quiet places where the big bucks hide. I've always respected it, but I've never feared it. It was a known quantity. My wife Sarah passed on 5 years ago. The house has been too quiet ever since. It's just me and my dog, Buster.
He's a blue heeler, tough and smart, with a work ethic that would put most men to shame. He's my shadow, following me from the barn to the tractor to the house. He's got a deep, authoritative bark that can scare off a stray coyote, and he's never been afraid of anything I've seen on 4 legs. The nights on the farm used to be my favorite time. The air cools, the crickets start their chorus, and the whole world seems to settle into a deep, peaceful sleep. I'd sit on the porch swing with a cup of coffee, Buster at my feet, and just listen. The sound of the wind in the corn, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the lowing of the cattle in the pasture. It was a symphony of normalcy, a reassurance that all was right with the world. The trouble started subtly, as I suppose these things always do. It was late August. The corn was high and getting ready for harvest. The air was thick and heavy with the coming of autumn. The first thing I noticed was the livestock.
My cattle, usually so placid, were restless at night. I'd hear them moving around in the pasture long after they should have settled, occasional panicked bellows echoing across the fields. My chickens, too. They'd raise a racket in the coop at odd hours, a frantic cackling that spoke of pure terror. I'd go out with a flashlight, expecting to find a fox or a raccoon, but there was never anything there. The wire was secure, the door was latched. There was no sign of a predator, just the lingering scent of fear. Then Buster started acting strange. He was my barometer for the farm, and his needle was pointing straight to trouble. He stopped making his usual nightly patrol around the property line. Instead, he'd stick to the porch, whining low in his throat, the fur on his back ridged. He'd stare out into the darkness where the cornfield met the woods, his body tense as a coiled spring. He'd let out a low, guttural growl sometimes, a sound I'd never heard him make before.
It wasn't a warning bark. It was a sound of genuine dread. He refused to go near the forest edge, a place he used to love to explore. If I tried to walk him that way, he'd dig his paws in and pull back towards the safety of the farmhouse. I tried to reason it away. We had a black bear wander through the county a few years back. Maybe another one was making its rounds. That would explain the spooked cattle. Or perhaps a particularly bold pack of coyotes had moved into the area. It was plausible. Nature is always testing its boundaries. I told myself that's all it was. I double-checked the latches on the coop, walked the fence line looking for breaks, and made sure the barn was locked up tight every night. I was being cautious, but I wasn't truly worried yet. I was just dealing with a new variable, another farm problem to be solved with logic and hard work. The first piece of hard evidence came after a night of heavy rain. The ground was soft and muddy, perfect for holding tracks.
I was walking the edge of the property, checking for washouts, when I found them. They were near the tree line, pressed deep into the mud. At first glance, I thought they were from a wolf, but that didn't make sense. We don't have wolves in this part of Ohio. They were canine, certainly, with 4 distinct toe pads and the mark of claws. But the size was all wrong. They were enormous, bigger than any wolf track I'd ever seen in books or on television. They were as long as my hand and wider. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. I followed the tracks for about 20 yards. They came out of the woods, walked along the edge of the cornfield, and then disappeared back into the trees further down. The stride was what made the hair on my arm stand up. The distance between the prints was impossibly long, more than 6 feet from one to the next, and they were in a straight line, one directly in front of the other. It wasn't the gait of a 4-legged animal. It was walking on 2 legs. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. A man in some kind of costume? A prank? But the depth of the prints told another story. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy, sinking a good 4 inches into the dense, wet soil. No prankster could fake that kind of weight. I stood there for a long time, staring at those impossible tracks, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The symphony of the farm suddenly had a new, discordant note, and it was terrifying. I tried to push the tracks out of my mind. I even kicked dirt over them, as if burying the evidence would bury the fear that came with it. I told myself it had to be a hoax. Some local kids with a lot of time on their hands and a twisted sense of humor, trying to scare the old farmer. It was the only explanation that allowed the world to keep making sense. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for long distances, and they certainly don't leave canine prints. Wolves don't exist here. A human cause was the only logical answer, but the explanation felt hollow, insufficient. The weight of it, the sheer size. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a violation. The nights that followed were filled with a new kind of tension. The familiar sounds of the farm were now punctuated by an unnatural silence that would fall suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown. The crickets would stop chirping, the frogs in the pond would go quiet, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a dead, listening silence that was far more unnerving than any noise. Buster would sense it first, his head lifting, his ears perked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He would press himself against my leg, a warm, trembling weight that offered little comfort. We would sit there on the porch in the suffocating quiet, staring out at a darkness that no longer felt empty. A week after I found the tracks, the interaction became more direct. I was in the house, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard a sound from the barn. It was a distinct, metallic rattle. The sound of the heavy iron latch on the main door being lifted and dropped. I froze, dishcloth in hand. Buster, who had been dozing by the stove, shot to his feet, barking furiously at the back door. I grabbed the heavy mag light I keep by the fridge and went to the window. The floodlight on the barn wasn't on. I only turned it on when I was working late. I couldn't see anything but inky blackness. The rattling came again, more insistent this time. It was being jiggled, tested. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I thought about the sheriff, but what would I say? That someone was wiggling my barn door latch? They'd think I was a senile old man. I did the only thing I could think of. I flipped the switch for the barn floodlight.
A powerful beam of white light instantly washed over the entire area.
For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a large, dark shape recoiling back into the shadows at the corner of the building. But it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. It could have been a trick of the light. I stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching, but nothing moved. The next morning, I found long, deep scratches in the thick oak of the barn door, right next to the latch. They were gouges, really, splintering the wood. There were 3 of them, running parallel, and they were a good 5 feet off the ground. The fear was no longer a vague unease. It was a cold, constant presence, a guest that had moved into my house and refused to leave. I started carrying my old point .30-06 rifle with me whenever I had to do chores after dusk. It felt foolish and dramatic, but the weight of it in my hands was a small comfort. One night, I was sitting in my armchair reading, trying to lose myself in a book. Buster was asleep on the rug.
Suddenly, he shot up, hackles raised, and stared intently at the window behind my chair. He didn't bark, just let out a low, continuous growl. A moment later, I heard it. A soft, wet, sniffing sound, right on the other side of the glass, not 2 feet from my head. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I could hear the air being drawn in and pushed out, a deep, guttural respiration that sounded like a huge animal. It was slow, deliberate, investigative. My mind screamed at me to turn, to look, but I was paralyzed by a primal terror I had never known. The sniffing continued for what felt like an eternity, moving slowly along the window pane. Then, I heard a soft tapping, not with a knuckle, but with something hard, like a claw. Tap, tap, tap on the glass. It was testing it, seeing if it would give. Buster was going frantic now, barking and snarling, but he wouldn't leave my side. After a few moments, the sniffing stopped, and I heard the heavy tread of something walking away on the soft grass. I waited, my muscles screaming with tension, until I was sure it was gone. I never sat in that chair again. That was the turning point. Pranksters don't breathe on your windows in the middle of the night. Bears don't test your locks. This was something else, something intelligent and persistent. I knew I couldn't just keep hoping it would go away. I had to see it. I had to know what I was dealing with. So, the next clear night, I decided to stand watch. I didn't turn on any lights in the house. I pulled a wooden chair into the deepest shadows of the porch, dressed in dark clothing, and sat with the rifle across my lap. Buster was inside, locked in the bedroom. I didn't want him barking and giving me away. The hours crawled by. The moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the fields. The familiar night sounds were a thin veneer over the tense silence I was now acutely aware of. My eyes ached from straining to see into the darkness. I was starting to feel foolish, my back stiff, the night air chilling me to the bone. I was about to give up, to chalk it all up to an overactive imagination, when I saw it. At the far edge of the cornfield, where the tassels brushed against the first line of trees, a shape detached itself from the shadows. It wasn't a deer or a bear. It was tall, impossibly so, and it was standing on 2 legs. It moved with a strange, loping gait that was both fluid and jarringly unnatural. It was too far away to make out any real details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A massive, broad-shouldered torso tapered down to a narrower waist. Long, powerful-looking arms hung at its sides. It paused at the edge of the corn, standing perfectly still, and turned its head to survey the farm. And that's when I saw it clearly against the moonlight. The head was not human. It was long, with a pointed snout and upright ears. The distinct, undeniable profile of a canine. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Every rational explanation, every skeptical thought evaporated in that single moment. the tracks, the scratches, the breathing at my window. It all snapped into a horrifying, unbelievable focus. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something from a nightmare. It stood there for a full minute, scanning the yard, the house, the barn. I felt a profound sense of being watched, of being assessed. It was as if it knew I was there, hiding in the shadows, and it was showing itself to me on its own terms. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it took a step back and melted into the darkness of the woods. I sat there on the porch, shaking uncontrollably until the first hint of dawn streaked the eastern sky. For the next few nights, nothing happened. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, freighted with the knowledge of what was out there. I barely slept. I'd sit by the window with the rifle, watching the tree line, jumping at every shadow. The lack of activity was almost worse than the direct encounters. It was a psychological game. It was letting me stew in my own fear, letting me wonder when and where it would appear next. I felt like prey. I felt like I was being hunted on my own land, the place where I was supposed to be the master. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the west, a churning wall of black clouds that blotted out the sun in the late afternoon. The wind picked up, howling through the corn stalks, and the sky opened up. Rain came down in blinding sheets, driven sideways by the gusts. The lights flickered a few times and then went out with a final, definitive click, plunging the house into a deep, oppressive darkness. The only light was the intermittent, brilliant flash of lightning, which would illuminate the yard for a split second before darkness crashed back in. The roar of the thunder was so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. Buster was a wreck. He was pacing from the front door to the back, whining, his claws clicking on the hardwood floors. He was terrified of thunderstorms, but this was different. This was a deeper, more specific fear. He kept returning to the back door which faced the barn and letting out frantic, desperate barks. I tried to calm him, but it was no use. He was sensing something out there in the storm, something that the wind and rain couldn't mask. Then I heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm, a splintering crash from the direction of the barn. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of wood giving way under immense force. My prize bull, an Angus I'd raised from a calf, was in that barn.
He was worth a small fortune, but more than that, he was the future of my herd. My first thought was that a tree had come down on the roof. My second, more chilling thought was that it wasn't a tree. Against my better judgment, against every screaming instinct in my body, I knew I had to go out there. I couldn't just leave him. I pulled on my heavy raincoat and boots, grabbed the rifle, and took the big 6-cell flashlight from its hook by the door. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind and rain hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. The ground was already a river of mud. I leaned into the wind, flashlight beam cutting a shaky tunnel through the downpour, and started the 100-yard trek to the barn. Every flash of lightning revealed a world in chaos, trees bending, debris flying. And with every flash, I scanned the darkness around me, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I got closer, I could see the damage. The main barn door, made of 2-inch thick oak and reinforced with steel braces, was torn half off its track. It hung crookedly, swinging back and forth in the wind like a broken limb. The crash I'd heard was the sound of it being ripped from its moorings. No storm could do that. No bear could do that. I stepped cautiously through the breach, rain dripping from the brim of my hat, and shone my light into the cavernous darkness of the barn. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and wet hay. And another smell, a musky canine odor, like a wet dog, but stronger, wilder. My light beam swept across the stalls, searching. And then it found him. My bull was down. He was lying on his side in the middle of the central aisle, his massive form still and lifeless. His neck was bent at a sickening, impossible angle. There were no marks on him, no signs of a struggle, just that clean, brutal snap.
It would have taken unbelievable strength to do that. As I absorbed the shock of it, a movement in the shadows behind the bull caught my eye. Something was hunched over him. I raised the flashlight, my hand trembling so badly the beam danced wildly. It stood up. It unfolded itself from the shadows, rising to its full, terrifying height. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. The flashlight beam hit it square in the chest, and I saw it all with perfect, horrifying clarity. The head was that of a monstrous wolf, or maybe a huge German shepherd. It was covered in coarse, matted fur, a mix of dark gray and black. The ears were pointed and erect, swiveling to track my every move. The muzzle was long and filled with yellowed fangs that were bared in a silent snarl. But the eyes were the worst part. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, calculating, and they glowed a sickly, luminous amber in the beam of my light. They were staring right at me. Its body was a grotesque parody of a man's. The shoulders were immensely broad and powerful, packed with coiled muscle that was visible even under the thick fur. The torso was lean and ripped, tapering down to a narrow waist. The arms were too long for the body, disproportionate, and they ended in huge 5-fingered hands that looked disturbingly human, if not for the thick black claws that tipped each finger. Its legs were the most alien part of it. They were bent backward at the knee, like a dog's, with powerful haunches that spoke of incredible leaping ability. It was standing there, on those wrong-jointed legs, balanced perfectly, a creature of nightmare made real. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a vibration that I felt in my bones more than I heard with my ears. My training, my lifetime of experience with a rifle, all of it screamed at me to shoot. But I was frozen. My mind was struggling to process the sight before me. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. But the dead bull at its feet, the smell of blood in the air, the sheer physical presence of the thing, it was all too real. It didn't charge me. That's what made it even more terrifying. A rabid animal would have charged. This thing, it watched me. It looked from my face down to the rifle in my hands and then back to my eyes. It understood. It recognized the rifle as a weapon, as a threat. There was no dumb animal instinct here. This was cold, predatory intelligence. It took a slow step to the side, never taking its glowing eyes off me. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was shocking for a creature of its size. It was using the stalls and the shadows to its advantage, trying to break my line of sight. It was a tactical move. It was hunting me. Then, with a sudden, explosive movement, it reached out with one of its long arms and swiped at a tall stack of hay bales nearby. The bales toppled over with a crash, sending up a cloud of dust and straw. It was a diversion, a calculated act to make me flinch, to draw my attention. The tactic worked. My eyes darted to the falling bales for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the creature lunged. But not at me. It moved with incredible speed towards the broken doorway, a blur of dark fur and muscle. I reacted on pure instinct. I snapped the rifle up to my shoulder, found the moving shape in my sights, and fired.
The roar of the .30-06 in the enclosed space of the barn was deafening. The recoil slammed into my shoulder. I saw the creature flinch, a spray of something dark erupting from its left shoulder. It let out a sound that was not of this world. It was a high-pitched scream of agony mixed with a deep, furious wolf howl. It was a sound of pain and pure, unadulterated rage. It stumbled but didn't fall. It spun around, its amber eyes now burning with a malevolent fire.
It glared at me, and I saw not just rage, but a look of pure, murderous hatred. It understood that I had heard it. It reached up with its uninjured arm, grabbed the splintered frame of the barn door, and with a sickening crack, ripped a piece of wood as thick as my arm completely free. With a guttural roar, it hurled the makeshift club at me. I threw myself to the side, landing hard in the muddy straw. The chunk of wood flew past my head with the force of a cannonball and smashed into the stall wall behind me, shattering the planks. That was my chance. It was wounded, enraged, and momentarily focused on its active fury. I didn't think about fighting it. I didn't think about being a hero. I was a 68-year-old man, and I was facing a monster from the deepest pit of hell. My only thought was survival. I scrambled to my feet, leaving the flashlight on the floor where it had fallen, and I ran. I fled the barn and plunged back out into the storm, not daring to look back. I ran harder than I had in 30 years, my lungs burning, my legs pumping through the thick mud. I could hear it roaring in the barn behind me, a sound of frustrated fury that was quickly swallowed by the thunder. I reached the back porch, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key in the lock. Buster was going absolutely insane inside, throwing himself against the door. I finally got it open, stumbled inside, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers slick with rain and mud, and shot it home. Not a second later, an immense weight slammed into the other side of the door, making the whole frame shudder. The impact was so powerful, it knocked a picture off the wall. Then came the sounds. A deep, wet sniffing at the crack beneath the door. Then scratching. A heavy, deliberate scraping of claws against the wood, gouging deep furrows in the paint. And that low, guttural growl, right there, just inches away on the other side of the door. I backed away, raising the rifle again, my back hitting the kitchen counter. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the living room, in the dark, every light in the house dead. I just sat there, rifle in my lap, listening. I heard it circle the house, a heavy two-legged tread in the mud outside. I heard it at the windows, the tap-tap-tap of a claw on the glass. I heard it test the front door, the knob rattling. It was systematically checking for a way in. It was hunting me. The sounds finally faded away sometime in the gray pre-dawn hours, just as the storm began to break. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, wide-eyed and shaking, until the sun came up. The next morning, the world looked deceptively normal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean-washed sky and a world of mud. But the evidence of the night's horror was everywhere. The barn door was a wreck, my bull was dead, and my back door looked like a giant cat had used it as a scratching post. There were massive, canine-like tracks all around the house, deep in the mud, confirming it had circled my home for hours. I knew I had to call the law. As much as I dreaded the disbelief, I couldn't just ignore this. Deputy Miller came out. He's a good kid. I've known his family for years. I watched him grow up. He was respectful, but his eyes were full of a polite skepticism as I told him my story. I walked him through it, showing him everything. The barn door, the dead bull with its snapped neck, the splintered wood where the creature had ripped off a piece of the frame. I showed him the deep claw marks on my back door and the impossible bipedal tracks in the mud. He took pictures with his phone and made notes in a little pad. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He listened patiently as I described the creature,
The canine head, the amber eyes, the man-like body, the backward bent legs. I saw the look on his face change from professional concern to a kind of gentle pity. He was looking at me like I was a grieving old man who had lost a prize bull to a bear, and whose mind, addled by the storm and the shock, had filled in the blanks with fantasy. He was trying to be kind, but it was insulting. The official report came a few days later. The death of my bull was attributed to a large, unidentified predator consistent with a black bear. The damage to the barn and my house was also blamed on the bear, which they suggested was likely rabid, explaining its unusual aggression. The tracks? Indeterminate due to distortion from heavy rainfall. My description of an 8-foot-tall bipedal canine was not in the report. My story was gently and officially erased, replaced with a mundane, acceptable explanation. They offered to have the game warden set some bear traps. I declined. I knew a bear trap wouldn't do a damn bit of good. I felt completely isolated. Everyone in town heard the story, of course. The official version.
Old Man Wells lost his prize bull to a bear during the big storm. Some of them heard the other version too, the one that leaked out through gossip, that Old Man Wells had lost his mind, that he was seeing monsters. People started looking at me differently at the feed store, at the post office. They'd give me a sad, knowing little smile. The kind of smile you give someone you think is no longer playing with a full deck. I was the crazy old farmer. About a week later, Sheriff Brody found me in the hardware store. He's been the county sheriff for almost 40 years, set to retire next spring. He's a man of few words, but he sees everything. He asked me how I was holding up. I just grunted, not wanting to talk about it. He put a hand on my shoulder and steered me toward a quiet aisle filled with plumbing supplies. He looked me straight in the eye, and his face was grim. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "I read Miller's full report, the one with your original statement in it." I waited, not sure what to say. "Listen to me," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "You sell that bull's death to the insurance company as a bear attack. You take the money and you don't argue. And you reinforce your doors. You buy more ammunition for that rifle of yours. And you do not, under any circumstances, go into those woods after dark. You don't even step off your porch." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Over the years, I've had maybe half a dozen reports like yours. From seasoned hunters, trappers, other farmers who live up against the forest. Men like you, who aren't prone to making things up. Stories about a tall, hairy creature that walks on two legs like a man, but has the head of a wolf. We never put it in the official reports. What would we do? Start a monster hunt? Cause a panic? There's nothing we can do. So we file it under bear or unexplained, and we tell people to be careful." His words were a strange mixture of validation and terror. I wasn't crazy. He believed me. But his confirmation meant that the thing was real, and that the authorities knew about it and were actively choosing to do nothing. It was a silent, unofficial policy of denial. "Just be careful, Arthur," he said, giving my shoulder a final squeeze before walking away. That quiet conversation was more frightening than any of the official dismissals. It confirmed that I was on my own, and that the monster in my field was a known and ignored quantity. The farm is different now. I sold off the rest of my cattle and most of the chickens. I couldn't stand the thought of them being out there, unprotected, just bait in a field. The place is too quiet. The silence I used to find peaceful is now unnerving, a blank canvas on which my fear paints terrible pictures. I spent a small fortune reinforcing the house. I installed steel doors with multiple deadbolts and shatterproof glass in the windows. I put up motion-activated floodlights, the kind they use in prison yards, that can turn my entire property into daylight with the flip of a switch. My house is no longer a home. It's a fortress. I've aged a decade in the last few months. I don't sleep through the night anymore. I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing amber eyes burned into the back of my eyelids. I see it standing over my bull, the raw power in its form, the cold intelligence in its gaze. I hear that unholy scream, part howl, part shriek. I have the rifle with me always.
It leans against the wall next to my bed at night, and it sits in the passenger seat of my truck when I have to go to town. I've become a prisoner on my own land. The setting of the sun, which I used to love, now brings a knot of cold dread to my stomach. Night is no longer a time for rest. It is a time for vigilance. I live with a constant, low-level hum of fear. Every time the wind rustles the corn, every time a branch snaps in the woods, my heart leaps into my throat. I find myself watching the tree line constantly, scanning for any sign of movement. I feel its presence, even when I can't see it. It's like the woods themselves are watching me now. I know it's still out there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll find new tracks at the edge of the property, a silent reminder that it hasn't forgotten me, that it's just waiting. I wounded it. I challenged it. And a predator like that doesn't forget. I'm telling you this because you need to know. You can call me a liar or a crazy old man. It doesn't matter to me anymore. I know what I saw. The world you think you live in, the safe, predictable world where everything has a scientific name and a logical explanation, that world is a thin, fragile veneer. And underneath it, in the dark places, in the deep woods, and the lonely corners of the map, older things still exist. Things that have been here long before us, and will be here long after we're gone. They are smart, they are powerful, and they view us as little more than intruders in their world. We've forgotten how to be afraid of the dark, but we were afraid for a reason. So if you ever find yourself out in the country, late at night, and all the sounds of nature suddenly go silent, don't ignore it. That's your most ancient instinct telling you that something is wrong. Listen to that feeling. Get in your car, go back to your house, lock your doors. Don't be proud. Don't be curious. Because you need to understand that out there, in the dark, you are not at the top of the food chain. Not anymore.